Chapter 6. The Road Ahead. Many people nowadays assume that the collapse of the current economic order in the industrial world must lead to mass death and a descent into savagery. This hardly follows. Most of the world's nations have undergone political and social collapse at least once in the course of the last century. The process can certainly be traumatic, but it isn't the end of the world. Whatever crises drive today's industrial order to its end, and whatever national or international traumas supervene until some degree of stability returns, there will be a place for new politics when the future governments of today's industrial nations, or the governments of the new political units that emerge from the wreckage, get to work picking up the pieces. This does not mean that all of today's problems can be solved by a change in politics, or for that matter, of politicians. An article of faith in many circles today holds that everything that's wrong in the world is the fault of the institutions or personalities in charge, and can be fixed by replacing them with some other set of institutions or personalities. That notion has been tested more thoroughly by history than any other hypothesis in the social sciences, and it has pretty consistently failed. It seems likely to help matters considerably if we accept that people will not behave like angels no matter how or whether they are governed, or who, if anyone, does the governing, and if, in the process, we admit that human beings are incurably human, that is, capable of the full spectrum of good and evil all by themselves, rather than moral puppets who can be expected to dance on command to the tune of a good or evil system. It's easy to come up with a perfect system of human society, in other words, so long as it doesn't have to work in the real world. And it's very easy to compare the glories of a perfect system as it exists on paper to the failings of a system in the real world. Nearly always, though, what John Kenneth Galbraith said about innovation in finance is just as true of innovation in political and social institutions. What gets ballyhooed as new and revolutionary thinking is normally the repetition of a fairly small set of fallacies that worked very poorly the last dozen times or so that they were tried, and will work just as poorly this time too. Those systems that function at all are fairly few in number, though there are plenty of variations on the basic themes. And the ones that have become standard in the world's industrial nations, representative democracy in politics, a mixed market system in economics, have certain advantages. Though the current examples of these systems are troubled, corrupt, and at risk of being overwhelmed by the consequences of bad decisions made over the last few decades, they have still shown themselves to be less dysfunctional most of the time than most of the alternatives that have actually been tried. There's a reason for this. Though they are rarely recognized as such, societies and economies are natural systems. They are as natural to human beings as hives are to bees or packs to wolves, and the process of evolution and selection that have shaped them over time are much the same as the processes that shape the social behavior of other animals. One of the crucial lessons today's environmental crisis is teaching us is that natural systems do not take well to being restructured from the ground up to fit human notions. The evidence of history suggests that with societies, as with other natural systems, change happens most successfully by way of simple mutations rather than complete reshapings. The expansion of civil rights over the last century and a half is a case in point. A set of rights and responsibilities that worked well when applied to a relatively small group of people, in the case of the United States, white men who owned property, has proven to work even better when extended to the adult population as a whole. Meanwhile, attempts to overturn the entire structure of society at once, for example the French and Russian revolutions, failed to produce anything but an explosion of violence and tyranny. Thus, no grandiose plan for the complete transformation of everything, of the sort that have been in vogue among social reformers for so many years, will be presented here. Instead, I will suggest a handful of limited, tightly focused changes, mutations, if you will, that could have a real chance, if implemented, of canceling out some of the self-defeating habits of the current economic system and replacing them with effective incentives toward the habits industrial societies need to establish. Many of the forces pushing us toward collapse are a product of the economic mistakes already discussed in this book and in the ways those mistakes are reflected in public policy. Those could conceivably be changed in time to matter. The transition from an economy of abundance that defined the recent past to the economy of scarcity that will define the near future bids fair to open a window of opportunity for change, though this in itself does not guarantee that the changes in question will be for the better. The accumulated burdens of past mistakes weigh heavily enough on the future that changes of this sort won't stave off a great deal of trouble and suffering. But it's possible that a shift to saner policies, backed by more realistic economic ideas, could cushion the end of the age of abundance, and make it easier to allocate resources to projects that will actually do some good, instead of pursuing policies which, like nearly all of the economic policies currently in place in the industrial world, will simply make matters worse. In the following pages, I propose to suggest some of the possibilities still open to the industrial world. Remembering what worked. At the head of the list of useful steps belongs the recognition that governments might find it useful to stop making the predicament of the industrial world worse than it already is. The decision of the U.S. government to deal with the immediate impacts of the 2008 real estate crash by what is euphemistically called quantitative easing, and is better known as printing money, is a case in point. Nearly every penny of the money voted by Congress and conjured into being by the Federal Reserve was given to the same huge banks and financial corporations that caused the real estate bubble in the first place. Some of that money went into bailouts of financial corporations. Some of it was used to subsidize new and refinanced mortgages for consumers, in the hope that these could be used to prop up one set of unpayable debts with another. The result in both cases has been the perpetuation of the same disastrous imbalances that helped spawn the housing bubble in the first place, while flooding the tertiary economy with even higher levels of unpayable debt. Such antics have given additional fuel to those who claim that government has no business taking action affecting the market at all. Still, the fact that competent doctors maim and kill their patients on occasion does not mean that all medical care is a bad idea. Markets, despite their benefits, are not uniquely gifted with a perfect ability to make economic decisions. This has become a controversial point in recent years. Just as a great many people on the left have picked up the dubious habit of using labels such as fascism for any political system to the right of Hillary Clinton, a great many people on the right seem to have convinced themselves that any form of economic regulation at all is tantamount to some sort of neo-Marxist hobgoblin. It seems to have been forgotten that a spectrum exists of something other than its two endpoints. Drowning, however, is not the only alternative to dying of dehydration. There's a middle ground that is noticeably more pleasant than either. The same principle applies in economics. The experiment of having government own all the means of production in an industrial society along the lines proposed by Marx received a thorough test at the hands of the communist bloc and failed abjectly to produce the benefits Marx claimed it would produce. At the same time, the experiment of having government keep its hands off the economy altogether in an industrial society along the lines proposed by a great many free market proponents these days received an equally thorough test and failed just as dismally. In America, that test ran from the end of the Civil War into the first decade of the 20th century, and the result was a catastrophic series of booms and busts. The transfer of most of the nation's wealth to a tiny minority of wealthy people, the bitter impoverishment of nearly everyone else, and a level of social unrest that included 2 presidential assassinations and so many bomb attacks on the rich and their families that bomb-throwing anarchists became a regular theme of music hall songs. It's always possible for theorists to contrast a utopian portrait of a free market economy against the gritty and unwelcome realities of extreme socialism, just as it's possible for people on the other side of the spectrum to contrast a utopian portrait of a socialist economy with the equally grim and unwelcome realities of unfettered capitalism. Both make great rhetorical strategies, since the human mind is easily misled by binary logic. If A is evil, it seems wholly reasonable to claim that the opposite of A must be good. The real world does not work that way, but this is hardly the only case in which rhetoric ignores reality. Thus, it simply isn't true that the best, or for that matter the only alternative, to the unchecked rule of corporate Robber barons is Marxist-style state ownership of the economy. Once again, dying from heat stroke is not the only alternative to dying from hypothermia. It means rather that something between these two extremes might be worth trying, especially if it can be shown by historical evidence to work tolerably well in practice. Of course, this is what history does show. Broadly speaking, economies that leave the means of production in private hands, but use appropriate regulation to harness their energies to the public good, consistently produce more prosperity for more people than either unfettered capitalism or extreme socialism. This being said, the midpoint between these extremes may not lie where today's conventional wisdom tends to place it. Consider an example from the not-too-distant past. A large industrial nation with a capitalist economy that had remarkably tough regulations restricting the growth of private fortunes and the abuses to which capitalist economies are so often prone. The wealthiest people in that nation paid more than 90% of their annual income in tax, and monopolistic practices on the part of corporations faced harsh and frequently applied judicial penalties. The financial sector was particularly tightly leashed. Interest rates on savings accounts were fixed by the government. Usury laws put very low caps on interest rates for loans, and legal barriers prevented banks from expanding out of local markets or crossing the firewall between consumer banking and the riskier world of corporate investment. Consumer credit was so difficult to get as a result that most people did without it most of the time, using layaway plans and Christmas Club savings programs to afford large purchases. According to the standard rhetoric of free market proponents these days, so rigidly controlled an economy ought by definition to be hopelessly stagnant and unproductive. This shows once again the separation of rhetoric from reality, however. For the nation I have just described was the United States during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, that is, during one of the most sustained periods of prosperity, innovation, economic development, and international influence this nation has ever seen. Now, of course, there were many other factors behind America's 1950s success, just as there were other factors behind the decline since then. Still, it's worth noting that as the economic regulations of the 1950s have been dismantled, in every case under the pretext of boosting America's prosperity, the prosperity of most Americans has gone down, not up. The economic regulations that shaped the American economy in the 1950s had a curious dimension, though. Outside of antitrust legislation, very little of it applied to the economy of goods and services on any level, whether that of mom-and-pop grocery stores or big industrial conglomerates. The bulk of it, and very nearly all of the strictest elements in it, focused on the financial industry. In the terms used in this book, instead of regulating the production and consumption of goods and services in the secondary economy, the economic policies of the Eisenhower era focused on regulating the tertiary economy, ensuring that too much tertiary wealth did not end up concentrated unproductively in too few hands, and controlling its propensity to multiply as enthusiastically as rabbits on Viagra. That distinction between a relatively unregulated secondary economy and a tightly controlled tertiary economy seems to have worked fairly well, just as the removal of all limits on the tertiary economy has consistently ended very badly. It makes a good measure of how far the United States has come as a nation that the economic policies of one of the most successful 20th century Republican administrations would be rejected by most of today's Democrats as too far to the left. A case could be made, in fact, that far and away the most sensible thing the U.S. Congress could do today, in the face of an economy that has very nearly choked to death on its own bubbles, is to reenact the economic legislation in place in the 1950s, line for line. Such proposals outrage the common conviction that going backwards is a bad thing. Still, when you're hiking in the woods and discover that you've taken a trail that leads someplace you don't want to go, your best bet is normally to turn around and go back to the last place where you were still going in the right direction. Defending the commons. This strategy of returning to ways of doing things that have worked in the past, however, will not address the conflict between the limitless tertiary economy and the hard limits of the primary economy, which is the ultimate driving force behind the crisis in industrial society. As we've seen, resource depletion imposes costs, and often drastic ones, on the economy. Under current economic arrangements, however, those costs are not charged to the people who benefit from the activities in question. The owner of an oil well, for example, gets the economic benefits of pumping oil out of the ground, but does not have to pay for the impact that today's extraction will have on tomorrow's economy. For many years, in fact, government policies in many industrial nations have actually rewarded oil well owners for accelerating the depletion of the resource and imposing massive costs on the future. In the same way, the owner of a smokestack that dumps pollution into the atmosphere gets the economic benefits of whatever activity produces the pollution, but does not have to pay for any of the costs incurred throughout the economy as a result of the pollution. This asymmetry has at least two results. First, and most obvious, neither the oil well owner nor the smokestack owner has any economic incentive to decrease the negative impacts of his or her activities. Second, the long-term economic burdens of depletion and pollution are not included in measures of the costs of the well or the smokestack. The result is a massive distortion in our understanding of the realities that shape our lives. It's generally not considered a viable business plan, outside of today's financial industry, that is, to make large profits in the short term by running up debts so large the business will have to declare bankruptcy in the not-too-distant future. Yet this is exactly what an economic system that ignores the cumulative costs of resource depletion and pollution is doing, on an even larger scale. The future costs of extracting resources from depleted reserves and mitigating the impacts of a polluted environment have the same effect as the future costs of debt service on excessive borrowing. They make the act of buying temporary prosperity in the near future a cause of impoverishment or collapse further down the road. Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons, as already discussed, addresses the same issue. Hardin showed that when the benefits from exploiting a resource went to individuals, but the costs were spread throughout the community, individuals intent on maximizing their own individual benefit would overexploit the resource and cause the whole community to suffer drastic losses in the longer run. His logic was impeccable, and there are plenty of real-world examples of resource exhaustion driven by this very process. But it has been pointed out by his critics that resources held in common have in fact been managed sustainably in countless cases around the world and throughout history. The question that has to be asked is where the difference comes in. This is where the divide pointed up earlier, the gap between economic realities and the models our society uses to understand them and predict their effects, comes into play. Hardin was quite correct that when individuals get the benefits of resource exploitation without paying their fair share of the costs to the community, exhaustion of the resource follows. Those societies that have managed their commons successfully, in turn, found ways of making those who gained the benefits of resource exploitation pay a commensurate share of the costs. The collective understanding of economics in these societies, in other words, and the social policies that they adopted to shape economic behavior, took the tragedy of the commons into account and adjusted the laws and customs governing economic exchanges accordingly. Several thoughtful proposals have been circulated over the years to match up costs and benefits. None of these proposals are likely to be popular anytime soon, since the average voter in the industrial world receives substantial benefits from the maltreatment of the primary economy of nature while avoiding most of the costs. To name only one example, the benefits of automobile transportation and central heating do not come with a bill for the air pollution these activities produce. Still, costs for other forms of commons are already shared by most people in the industrial world on a pay-as-you-go basis. Power and sewer bills come to mind as examples, and the same principle may be worth proposing to deal with the costs of maintaining natural commons as well. The acronym TANSTAAFL, T-A-N-S-T-A-A-F-L, short for There Ain't No Such Thing as a Free Lunch, popularized by Robert Heinlein in his science fiction novel The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, makes a good slogan for this approach. The entire industrial world has been treating the primary economy of nature as a source of free lunches for the last 3 centuries or so, with increasingly problematic results. One of the reasons why it's important to treat the natural world as an economic force in its own right, the primary economy in the terminology used in this book, is precisely the need to begin reckoning up harm to the natural systems as an economic cost that has to be dealt with in analysis of cost and benefits, not an externality that can be swept under the rug by a display of economic legerdemain. As people begin to get used to thinking of trees, bees, and mineral cycles as part of the economy that supports them and forms the unavoidable foundation for any real personal or national prosperity, the habit of treating nature as a disposable amenity will likely begin to give way to more rational and pragmatic ways of thinking. This will also require, of course, a reorientation of economic statistics. Today's figures, as discussed in detail earlier, ignore the primary economy completely, measure the secondary economy purely in terms of the tertiary, calculating production in dollars, say, rather than potatoes and haircuts, and focus obsessively on the tertiary. This fixation means that if an economic policy boosts the tertiary economy, it looks like a good thing, even if that policy harms the secondary or the primary economies, as it very often does. Thus, the choice of statistics isn't a neutral factor, or a simple one. If that choice echoes inaccurate presuppositions, for example, the fantasy that the human economy is independent of nature, it can feed those presuppositions right back in as a distorting factor into every economic decision. The solution is clear enough. Sort out primary, secondary, and tertiary inputs in the most important economic statistics. The gross domestic product forms an excellent example. Recalculating this according to the three economies just sketched out, the statisticians of some imaginary Bureau of Honest Figures might produce something like this. The gross primary product, or GPP, would be the value of all unprocessed natural products at the moment they enter the economy: oil as it reaches the wellhead, coal as it leaves the mine, grain as it tumbles into the silo, and so on, minus all the costs incurred in drilling, mining, growing, and so on. Those belong to the secondary economy. The gross secondary product, or GSP, might be the value of all goods and services in the economy except for raw materials from nature and financial goods and services. The gross tertiary product, or GTP, might be the value of all financial goods and services and all money and money equivalents produced by the economy. The value of having these three numbers alongside or instead of one gross domestic product is that they can be compared to one another and their shifts relative to one another can be tracked. If the GTP balloons and the other two products stay flat or decline, for example, that doesn't mean the country is getting wealthier. It means that the tertiary economy is inflating and needs to have some air let out of it before it busts in a speculative crash. If the GSP increases while the GPP stays flat and the cost of extracting natural resources isn't soaring out of sight, then the economy is becoming more efficient at using natural resources, in which case the politicians and executives have good reason to preen themselves in public. More generally, dividing up the GDP into these components would make it much easier to differentiate between movements in the real economies of goods and services on the one hand, and the mere multiplication of abstract paper wealth on the other. Taxing the right things. Another tool that deserves more attention than it has received is the seemingly unpromising field of tax policy. It's a subject on which a great deal of nonsense abounds just now. A recent book titled The End of Prosperity, for example, claims that if the U.S. government raised taxes to a level that would actually pay for the services it provides, the result would be, as the title claims, the end of prosperity. Somehow, the authors managed to ignore the fact that in the 1950s, when American prosperity was by most measures at its all-time peak, people in the upper tax brackets paid more than 90% of their income to Uncle Sam, and that the country has by most measures been less prosperous, not more, as those tax rates have been lowered. There's a reason for that, and it ties back into the distinctions among the primary, secondary, and tertiary economies central to the argument of this book. The primary economy of nature and the secondary economy of the production of goods and services by human labor are natural systems subject to negative feedback loops that tend to hold them in balance. The tertiary economy of money and other forms of abstract wealth, by contrast, is subject to positive feedback loops that drive it out of balance and tend to unbalance the other two economies as well. The feedback loops of the tertiary economy that cause the most damage are the ones that make accumulations of paper wealth increase exponentially in value. It's thus not hard to recognize that anything that drains off those accumulations, for example by putting them in the pockets of people who spend their money on groceries instead of more financial paper, tends to stabilize the economy. That's what the high tax rates of the 1950s did, and it's thus hardly accidental that the more drastically tax rates have been cut in the last 3 decades, and the more tertiary wealth have been shielded from taxes by special capital gains tax rates and the like, the more drastically the tertiary economy has manifested its normal tendency to run up extremes and blow itself up in the process. Still, there are arguably more tightly focused ways to drain off excesses from the tertiary economy, and the existing tax code also meshes very poorly with the primary economy and its emerging reality of scarce resources and overburdened natural cycles. In a world where the accelerating exploitation of natural resources and the accumulation of paper wealth are major sources of problems, while the human labor at the core of the secondary economy is the most renewable resource we have, we arguably tax the wrong things. Imagine, then, a tax code that taxes the right things instead. In this imaginary code, there are no sales taxes and no taxes on income from wages, salaries, dividends, royalties, and rents. That is, no taxes on the secondary economy at all. Instead, there are 2 classes of taxation. The first, on the primary economy, taxes natural goods and services. The second, on the tertiary economy, taxes interest income, capital gains, and all other money made from money. The taxes on natural goods and services would follow the same rough line of logic as property taxes do at present. Here in the United States, for example, the federal government, as trustee for the American people, effectively owns all the real estate within its borders. When you buy property, what you're buying is the right to use that property within the limits of the laws and the national interest, which is why China can't just contract with private landowners to buy a couple of disused fishing harbors on our west coast as bases for its navy. The same principle would just as reasonably apply to every other resource in the country. When you pump oil from the ground, you're depleting part of the patrimony of this nation, and you should have to pay the government for that privilege. When you dump smoke out of a tailpipe, equally, you're using the nation's atmosphere as a kind of gaseous landfill, and you should have to pay to do that. Every natural resource of every kind under this system would thus be subject to an extraction or a pollution tax. Resources mined in other countries and imported, whether in raw form or in its finished products, would be subject to an equivalent tariff to prevent manufacturers from stripping the resources of other countries in an attempt to avoid these taxes. The taxes would apply at the point where raw materials from the primary economy of nature enter the secondary economy, so that most of them would be paid by manufacturers, with the costs passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Now, of course, this would mean that many goods and services would cost considerably more than they do now. Since everyone would have the money that now goes to income and sales taxes, this may be a little less of a burden. But it's also relevant that people can avoid resource taxes by changing their buying habits. If you buy a hybrid car, you're going to pay a lot less in petroleum tax and a lot less in tailpipe tax as well, though the extraction taxes folded into the sticker price for the rare earth materials in the batteries and electronics may set you back a bit, as they should. If you don't own a car at all, you'll laugh all the way to the bank. Similarly, the price of a product made from a metal mined from the earth includes the extraction tax for the ore, but the price of the product made from recycled material doesn't. Recycled material is already in the secondary economy, and thus exempt from extraction taxes. This gives manufacturers a big incentive to use recycled material and undercut the competition. The second set of new taxes targets a different problem. Right now, with the tax laws we have, it's to the economic advantage of businesses to pull their money out of producing goods and services and put it into blowing bubbles in the tertiary economy of paper wealth. That's part of the reason why General Motors manufactured more financial paperwork than cars for quite a few years, until it got into a head-on collision with bubble economics. From a broader perspective, that's part of the reason why America produces so few goods and non-financial services nowadays, and so much in the way of abstract paper wealth. Taxing financial income, but not earned income, does a fair amount to reverse the equation. If putting your money into bonds or derivatives means that any profit you make suffers a large tax bite, while putting your money into producing goods and services means that you pocket the profits tax-free, derivatives and bonds will look much less inviting. Notice also how these two kinds of taxes work to take an even larger bite out of one of the most mistaken economic priorities of our time, the replacement of human labor by machines. Most industrial nations have a serious unemployment problem. Even before the most recent financial crisis, good working-class jobs were very hard to come by. There are plenty of reasons why that happened, but tax policies that make employers pay half again or more of the cost of a worker's wages in order to hire that worker certainly haven't helped. Eliminate those taxes and place taxes on energy and natural raw materials instead, and in a good many cases, a worker instead of a machine becomes the most cost-effective way to do the job. Other arrangements could easily be devised to accomplish the same ends. The point I want to make with this extended example, though, is that some of the ways we do business and pay, or don't pay, for government services don't fit the realities of an age of ecological limits. A tax code that burdens the secondary economy while encouraging the wasteful plundering of nature and the bubble-blowing antics of the tertiary economy is not going to help us weather the storms of the near future. Any tax code that does the opposite, that makes it more profitable to employ human labor to meet human needs, and less profitable to disrupt the natural cycles that undergird our survival, or to feed speculative excesses that pump imbalances into an already troubled economy, could be a very helpful asset in a time of crisis, and could be put in place tolerably easy, without having to tear an entire society to pieces and rebuild it from the ground up. Would such a tax code solve all our problems? Of course not. Still, the attitude that we have to find a single solution that deals with all our problems is a large reason why constructive responses to those problems seem so far out of reach. If we're to face the difficult future ahead of us with any sort of grace, that achievement is much more likely to happen as a result of careful, tentative steps than it is to unfold from some grandiose plan to reach a perfect world in a single leap. Monkeying with the tax code so that it rewards the economic behaviors that might help us get through the approaching troubles, rather than rewarding the economic behaviors that will only make things worse, is only one step in the necessary direction. But it's one step further than any industrial nation has yet gone, and thus is arguably worth taking. Housebreaking the Corporations. Another set of changes, mutations, to return to the biological metaphor, worth considering here involves changing the way that business corporations relate to the public good. This subject has seen a great deal of discussion in the alternative press over the last few years, much of it focused on the belief that corporations are something close to evil incarnate. The entire topic could use an approach less burdened with mythic archetypes. It is true, of course, especially in America, that corporate misbehavior has become common, and corporations have come to have an inappropriate degree of influence on the political process. But this latter could be said with equal truth of nearly every other large and well-funded institution in contemporary life, from the retiree lobby to the American Medical Association. The source of the political power of corporations and that of other influential groups deserves to be studied carefully. Despite the rhetoric of impending tyranny retailed equally by the far left and the far right these days, political power in most of today's industrial nations is not particularly centralized. Rather, it's highly diffused, distributed among the quarrelsome factions of a large and fractious political class. No one faction can carry out its agenda without the consent of many others, and the result is that any well-organized faction becomes a power broker. It can drive whatever bargains it wishes in exchange for supporting the agendas of other factions, and use that clout to defend those positions it considers non-negotiable. A good deal of the stalemate that puts necessary reforms out of reach in most of the capitals of the industrial world just now is a function of this process. It's hard to think of any such reform that won't step on the toes of at least one well-funded faction. And so business as usual proceeds on its merry way, even though almost everyone recognizes that the end result will be to nobody's benefit. Consider as one example out of many the way that the retiree lobby keeps the simplest and sanest response to America's looming budget crisis, a means test on Social Security and Medicare, from even coming up for discussion. The same process, enforced by one or another power center within the political class, puts every other effective reform equally out of reach. Corporations are merely one set of power centers making use of this system to pursue their own advantage at the cost of the general welfare. Certain details of the relationship between corporations and society, though, make the conflict between corporate interests and public welfare particularly frequent. Corporations, under the laws of the United States and most other nations, are legal persons. They have many, though not all, of the same rights that natural persons, that is, you and me, have under the law. The most obvious difference these days between corporations' persons and the other power centers that influence our collective decisions is that the corporate kind are noticeably more antisocial. They pursue their purposes, the production of tertiary wealth, with a single-mindedness and a lack of concern for consequences that, in natural persons, would be accurately labeled psychopathic. They've proven themselves consistently willing to lie, cheat, steal, and kill whenever the likely return on those acts outweighs the risk of punishment. E.F. Schumacher, who was amply familiar with these habits of corporate misbehavior, helped to solve them by encouraging different models of corporate governance. One of his central examples was a British firm, Scott Bader and Company Limited, which was organized as a partnership of its own employees. Similar schemes ranging from cooperatives to employee-owned corporations have been put to the test over the years and work at least as well as the usual style of corporate management. Still, no one has yet found a way to convince stockholders and corporate executives to voluntarily accept a reorganization that would sharply decrease their wealth and influence, and until some such means can be found, Schumacher's approach seems unlikely to make a large difference. Some writers in recent years, in response to the parade of corporate abuses, have simply turned up the rhetoric of moral denunciation, with the usual results: a warm glow of self-righteousness on the part of the denouncer, and no effect at all on the denouncee. Others have proposed various means for forcing corporate persons to behave themselves. One popular proposal would subject corporations to regular review by some independent body, which could annul the charter of any corporation that refused to be properly housebroken. What would keep this body honest in the face of the fantastic potential for corruption, the proponent of this notion does not say. But there's another issue here. We've actually got a tolerably effective way of responding to antisocial behavior. We just don't apply it to corporate persons the way we do natural persons. A glance back into the history of law may help clarify the matter. I'm not sure how many people these days know that the law codes of most European nations in the early Middle Ages operated almost entirely on the basis of fines. The principle of weergild, as it was called, gave each person a cash value. If a murder took place, the murderer had to pay the family of the victim that cash value as weergild for the death. Lesser injuries and insults called for lesser fees. It didn't work very well, not least because anyone who had enough money could act the way mainstream economists think we all ought to act, on the basis of a simple cost-benefit analysis. If you could afford to pay the weergild for killing somebody and decided it was worth the expense, why not? So as the Dark Ages gave way to a less chaotic times, legal codes across Europe replaced weergild with punishments that were a good deal less easy to shrug off. This is why natural persons who are convicted of felonies, by and large, can't get away with just paying a fine. They go to jail. Or, if the crime is heinous enough, and it happens in a jurisdiction with capital punishment, they die. While this approach also has its failings, it does seem to deter criminal activity a good deal more effectively than the Weirgild principle once did. From this perspective, the problem with corporate persons is simple enough. The only risk they run in breaking the law is that they have to pay Weirgild, and that doesn't constrain antisocial behavior any more effectively now than it did in the Dark Ages. My more perceptive readers may be wondering at this point whether I'm seriously proposing that corporations should be thrown in jail or put to death. This is indeed what I'm proposing, with the adjustments needed to account for the differences between corporate persons and natural persons. The essential nature of imprisonment for a crime, after all, is that the criminal ceases to be a free person. For a specified period of time, he is a chattel of society, and society has the right to profit from his labor during that period. And capital punishment? The criminal, having proven that he isn't willing to abide by even the most minimal standards of social existence, ceases to exist by act of society. Both of these can be applied to corporations easily enough. Imagine then that a corporation, we'll call it the Shyster Company, has just been caught deliberately selling worthless securities to widows and orphans. The district attorney files charges of felony fraud and theft in the state court. The trial date arrives, the lawyers bicker, the jury finds the defendant guilty as charged, and the judge sentences the corporation to 10 years in the slammer. In practice, what happens is that the judge appoints a trustee who takes control of Shyster and all its assets. For the next 10 years, Shyster is a wholly owned subsidiary of the state government. Its stock pays no dividends and has no voting rights. Its directors have to find something else to do with their time. And if the trustee decides that the CEO and other overpaid office fauna have to find new jobs, they have to find new jobs, assuming that they'll not be doing time themselves, as they very well could be. All profits earned by Shyster during its period of imprisonment go to the state government, subject to set-asides that pay restitution for the victims of the crime. Meanwhile, another conglomerate, we'll call this one Dirty Rotten Scoundrel Incorporated, has been caught knowingly selling food products tainted with deadly bacteria, and a dozen people have died. This time, the district attorney files charges for aggravated first-degree murder. The trial date arrives, the media has a field day, the lawyers bicker, the jury returns a verdict of guilty as charged, the judge sentences DRSI to death, and the appeals court upholds the sentence. In practice, what happens is that on the scheduled day of execution, DRSI ceases to exist. Its stock becomes worthless, its assets are sold off in an auction in which no former shareholder is allowed to bid, its name and trademarks can never be used again by anybody under penalty of law, and its creditors get whatever scraps are left once the victims' families receive their settlements. It's crucial that the stockholders in both cases and the creditors in the latter case suffer for the behavior of the corporation. The stockholders of a corporation are its owners, in fact, and law. They profit from its activities and therefore should pay for its crimes. The laws governing corporations limit the liability of stockholders to the value of their investment, and there's no need to overturn that principle. It simply needs to be applied to criminal cases in the same way that responsibility is applied in cases involving natural persons. Equally, those who loan money to a business already accept the risk that the business may go bankrupt and their money may be lost. Making corporations subject to criminal penalties simply applies the same principle of risk to the possibility that a corporation may violate the law and pay for its crimes. Thus, under this system, if word gets out that a corporation is pushing the limits of legality, the stockholders have a very strong incentive to sell, driving down the value of the stock. Equally, if lenders become aware that a corporation is engaged in really egregious behavior, they have a very strong incentive to charge higher interest rates or even to stop loaning money to the corporation. Neither has any such incentive under the current system, which is one reason why corporations act as though their quarterly profit statements are the only things that matter. To their stockholders and creditors, this is essentially the case. This proposal would change that. Finally, governments have a powerful incentive to enforce the law, which current corporate regulation schemes generally lack. Governments always need money. Raising taxes is unpopular. But catching a crooked corporation that has violated the law and making the rascals pay for their crime makes excellent press. And 5 or 10 years of corporate income in the state treasury would gladden the heart of even the most unregenerate corporate stooge in the state legislature. Readers may be wondering at this point whether I think such a proposal has the chance of a snowball in Beelzebub's backyard of being enacted. As it happens, I do. One of the repeated lessons of history is that the political power of business waxes during times of relative stability and crumbles in times of turmoil and crisis. The long European peace of the 19th century saw business interests dominate most Western governments to an extent that would be considered extreme even by today's lax standards. When that peace shattered in 1914, it took the power of big business with it, and by the time the rubble stopped bouncing in 1954, every Western country had either embraced some degree of socialism outright or adopted radical economic reforms that would have been considered unthinkable before a flurry of bullets at Sarajevo tipped the world into chaos. We are facing a similar age of crisis now, and the wide diffusion of power common in ages of prosperity is usually an early casualty of such times. As current distribution of power breaks down, and today's veto groups find themselves increasingly shut out of the emergency coalitions and charismatic governments that tend to rise in difficult eras, much of what passes for corporate power will inevitably turn out to be much more feeble than it looks today. Several countries, with Russia in the lead, have already seen showdowns between corporate influence and the power of national governments, and the corporations have not fared well in these battles. When the power of money faces off against the power of violence, money comes out a distant second. As the Great Recession deepens, the decline of world petroleum production begins to bite, and rising world powers contend with declining America and each other to settle whose will be the next global empire. The superiority of political and military force to money's influence is likely to play an increasingly large role in determining the balance of power. I suspect by the time the current mess gets much deeper, business interests will be facing organized efforts to do things much more drastic than simply holding corporations responsible for their crimes, and may be willing to bargain in the hope of survival in exactly the same way that their predecessors did in that earlier time of troubles. A crisis of complexity. Another set of ideas commonly suggested in response to the crisis of industrial society are more problematic than the reforms already suggested. These are the programs that seek to deal with the problems of our time by placing a flurry of additional laws and regulations and additional bureaucracies to enforce them on top of the existing laws, regulations, and bureaucracy we have now. Choose a crisis, from the puncturing of the housing bubble in 2008 to the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and you can count on finding someone, more often quite a few someones, who think the best way to respond is to impose more regulations, hire more bureaucrats, and provide more government grants. On the plane of popular culture, the same habit of thought pervades the often repeated suggestion that the crisis du jour can be solved by a Manhattan Project or Apollo program, government-run and lavishly funded with tax dollars. I am far from certain that this is a good idea. As Joseph Tainter has pointed out in his valuable book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, increases in social complexity are subject to the same law of diminishing returns as anything else, and sooner or later a society that responds to every challenge by adding a new layer of complexity will reach the point where adding more complexity causes more problems than it solves. Today's industrial societies, pushing the curve of diminishing returns with the help of abundant fossil fuel energy, have become more complex than any other human society in recorded history. Several observations concerning Tainter's insight are thus worth making here. First, the diminishing returns of complexity do not strike everywhere at once, but appear here and there at first, most often in whatever institutions or areas of life have been most heavily loaded with excessive complexity. Thus, a society that has overloaded itself with complexity will tend to heap up more complexity in some areas of life than others, and one or more of these areas will normally tip over into dysfunction sooner than the others. Thus, a society that is hammered by repeated crises of the same kind and tries to solve them with layers of additional complexity that consistently seem to make the problem worse may be at risk of tipping over into a wider dysfunction of which the visible crises are merely symptomatic. Second, if a society has driven itself past the point of negative returns on complexity and continues to try to add complexity to solve the resulting problems, it risks establishing a disastrous feedback loop in which its attempts to solve its problems become the major source of new problems. This can also apply to specifics as well as generalities, and show up first in particular aspects of a society's collective life. Third, one of the ironies faced by a society that has reached the point of negative returns on complexity as a means of problem solving is that thereafter, the only way it can solve its problems is by not solving its problems. Any attempt to solve problems by adding additional complexity will simply make matters worse, while allowing some particular problematic heap of complexity to crash and burn may just reduce the complexity of the whole system to a point at which something constructive can actually be done. In the extreme case, where an entire society has pushed itself past the point of negative returns on complexity, political and economic collapse can be an adaptive response to a rising spiral of crisis that can be ended in no other way. Now, the logical solution to a problem caused by too much complexity is to reduce the amount of complexity. Tainter argues that societal collapse has exactly this function. When a society has backed itself into a corner by heaping up more complexity than it can manage, collapse offers the only way out. Still, a proposal to reduce the complexity of contemporary civilization can count on getting no interest from the political classes of today's industrial nations, or for that matter, from the population at large. The experiment has been tried, after all. It's worth remembering the extent to which the baby steps toward lower complexity taken in the 1970s helped fuel the Reagan-Thatcher backlash of the 1980s. The hope of a mass conversion to sustainability by political means, by legislation, let's say, backed up by the massive new bureaucracy that would be needed to enforce green laws affecting every detail of daily life, is yet another attempt to solve a complexity-driven problem by adding on more complexity. That's a popular strategy these days. It makes sense to most of us, since it's the sort of thing that we're used to doing. And it would provide a large number of economic and social niches for specialists, in this case, members of the professional activist community who might reasonably expect to step into staff positions managing the new level of complexity. All of this is very familiar ground, echoing as it does the way that countless other efforts to reform have turned into layers of complexity in the past. To suggest, as I do, that it won't work doesn't mean that it won't be tried. Quite the contrary. As the industrial age winds down, very nearly every plausible attempt to solve the problems of complexity with more complexity will likely get at least some funding and be given at least a token trial. Much of the same process is already underway in the energy field. We've already had the corn ethanol boom here in the U.S. The cellulose ethanol and algal biodiesel booms have been delayed by the impact of a collapsing economy on credit markets, but somebody will doubtless find a way around that in good time. Down the road a bit, a crash program to build nuclear power plants is pretty much a foregone conclusion. Fusion researchers will have the opportunity to flush billions more dollars down the same rat hole they've been attempting to fill since the 1950s. You name it. If it's complex and expensive, it will get funding. Not all of that money will be entirely wasted either. Current wind power technologies and PV panels may not be sustainable over the long term, but for the decades immediately ahead, they're an excellent investment. Anything that can keep the grid supplied with power as fossil fuel production drops out from under the world's industrial economies may be able to help make the next few decades less brutal than they might otherwise be. With any luck, there'll be a boom in home insulation and weather stripping, a boom in solar hot water heaters, a boom in backyard victory gardens and the like. Small booms, probably, since they aren't complex and expensive enough to catch the contemporary imagination, but even a small boom might help. On the whole, though, the pursuit of complexity as a solution for the problems caused by complexity is a self-defeating strategy. It happens to be the self-defeating strategy to which we're committed, collectively and in most cases individually as well, and it can be dizzyingly hard for many people to think of any action at all that doesn't follow it. Can you think of a way to deal with the problems of complexity in today's industrial nations, problems that include, but are not limited to, rapidly depleting energy supplies, ecological destruction, and accelerating economic turbulence, that doesn't simply add another layer of complexity to the mess? There's at least one such way, pioneered by Schumacher in a different context. It starts with what he termed the principle of subsidiary function. This rule holds that the most effective arrangement to perform any function whatsoever will always assign that function to the smallest and most local unit that can actually perform it. Let me say this again. Schumacher's principle of subsidiary function holds that the most effective arrangement to perform any function whatsoever will always assign that function to the smallest and most local unit that can actually perform it. It's hard to think of any principle that flies more forcefully in the face of every presupposition of the modern world. Economies of scale and centralization of control are so heavily and unthinkingly valued that it rarely occurs to anyone that in many situations they might not actually be economies at all. Still, Schumacher was not a pie-in-the-sky theorist. He drew his conclusions on the basis of most of a lifetime as a working economist in the business world. He noticed that the bigger and more centralized an economic or political system happens to be, the less effectively it could respond to the complex texture of local needs and possibilities that makes up the real world. This rule can be applied to any aspect of the predicament of industrial society you care to name. Attempts to make such a response on the highest and least local level possible, for example, the failed international negotiations to establish a global response to anthropogenic climate change, have done quite a respectable job of offering evidence for Schumacher's contention. Attempts to do the same thing at a national level aren't doing much better. The lower down the ladder you go, and the closer you get to individuals and families confronting the challenges of their own lives, the more success stories you find. By the same logic, the best place to start backing away from an overload of complexity is in the daily life of the individual. What sustains today's social complexity, in the final analysis, is the extent to which individuals turn to complex systems to deal with their needs and wants. To turn away from complex systems on that individual level, in turn, is to undercut the basis for social complexity, and to begin building frameworks for meeting human needs and wants of a much simpler and thus more sustainable kind. It also has the advantage, not a small one, that it's unnecessary to wait for international treaties or government action or anything else to begin having an effect on the situation. It's possible to begin right here, right now, by identifying the complex systems on which you depend for the fulfillment of your needs and wants, and making changes in your own life to shift that dependency onto smaller and more local systems, or onto something yourself, or onto nothing at all. After all, the simplest way to deal with a want or need, when doing so is biologically possible, is to stop needing or wanting it. Such personal responses have traditionally been decried by those who favor grand collective schemes of one kind or another. Still, it deserves to be remembered that a small step that actually happens will do more good than a grandiose plan that never gets off the drawing board, a fate suffered by nearly all of the last half-century's worth of grandiose plans for sustainability, starting from personal choices and local possibilities rather than abstract and global considerations, makes a good deal more likely whatever evolves out of the process might actually work. Tackling the crisis of industrial society from the top down has been tried over and over again by activists for decades now, with no noticeable results. Maybe it's time to try something else. Back to the future. One application of the principle of subsidiary function that has already received serious attention within the peak oil community is the need to relocalize economic activity, that is, to shift from centralized production of goods and services and continental or intercontinental supply and distribution chains to regional or local production of goods and services using locally available resources. Relocalization is a standard event in ages of contraction. When complex societies overshoot their resource bases and decline, centralized economic arrangements fall apart. Long-distance trade declines sharply, and the vast majority of what we now call consumer goods get made at home or very close to home. That violates much of the conventional wisdom that governs economic decisions these days. Centralized economic arrangements are thought to yield economies of scale that make them more profitable than decentralized local arrangements. When history conflicts with theory, though, it's not history that's wrong. So a second look at the conventional wisdom is in order. The economies of scale and the resulting profitability of centralized economic arrangements don't happen by themselves. They depend, among other things, on transportation infrastructure. This doesn't happen by itself either. It happens because governments pay for it for purposes of their own. The Roman roads that made the tightly integrated Roman economy possible, for example, and the interstate highway system that does the same thing for America, were not produced by entrepreneurs. They were created by central governments for military purposes. The legislation that launched the interstate system in the U.S., for example, was pushed by the Department of Defense, which wrestled with transportation bottlenecks all through the Second World War. Government programs of this kind subsidize economic centralization. The same thing is true of other requirements for centralization. For example, the maintenance of public order, so that shipments of consumer goods can get from one side of the country to the other without being looted. Governments don't establish police forces and defend their borders for the purpose of allowing businesses to ship goods safely over long distances, but businesses profit mightily from these indirect subsidies nonetheless. When civilizations come unglued, in turn, all these indirect subsidies for economic centralization go away. Roads are no longer maintained, harbors silt up, bandits infest the countryside, migrant nations invade and carve out chunks of territory for their own, and so on. Centralization stops being profitable because the indirect subsidies that make it profitable aren't there anymore. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire, a well-documented example, was a process of radical relocalization, and the result was the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire handled defense by putting huge linear fortifications along its frontiers. The Middle Ages replaced this with fortifications around every town and baronial hall. The Roman Empire was a political unity where decisions affecting every person within its borders were made by bureaucrats in Rome. Medieval Europe was the antithesis of this, a patchwork of independent feudal kingdoms the size of a Roman province, which were internally divided into self-governing fiefs, those into smaller fiefs, and so on, to the point that a village with a fortified manor house at its center could be an autonomous political unit with its own laws and the right to wage war on its neighbors. The same process of radical decentralization affected the economy as well. The Roman economy was just as centralized as the Roman polity. In major industries such as pottery, mass production at huge regional factories was the order of the day, and the products were shipped out via sea and land for anything up to 1,000 miles to the end user. That came to a halt when roads weren't repaired anymore, the Mediterranean became pirate haven, and too many of the end users were getting dispossessed and dismembered by invading Visigoths. The economic system that evolved to fill the void left by Rome's implosion was thus every bit as relocalized as a feudal barony, and for exactly the same reasons. That system was based on craft guilds, which worked in a distinctive and, to modern minds, highly counterintuitive way. Each city, and city in this context means anything down to a town of a few thousand people, was an independent economic center providing skilled trades to a fairly small region. The city might have a few industries of more than local fame, but most of its business consisted of manufacturing and selling things to its own citizens and the surrounding countryside. The manufacturing and selling was managed by guilds, which were cooperatives of master craftsmen. To get into a guild-run profession, you had to serve an apprenticeship, usually 7 years, during which you got room and board in exchange for learning the craft and working for your master. You then became a journeyman and worked for a master for wages until you could produce your masterpiece. That's where the word comes from, which was an example of craftwork fine enough to convince the other masters to accept you as an equal. Then you became a master with voting rights in the guild. The guild had the responsibility under feudal municipal laws to establish minimum standards for the quality of goods, to regulate working hours and conditions, and to control prices. Economic theories of the time held that there was a just price for any good or service, usually the price that had been customary in the region since time out of mind, and municipal authorities could be counted on to crack down on attempts to charge more than the just price. Most forms of competition were off limits. If you made your apprentices and journeymen work evenings and weekends to outproduce your competitors, for example, or sold goods below the just price, you'd get in trouble with the guild and could be barred from doing business in the town. The only form of competition that was encouraged was to make and sell a superior product. This was the secret weapon of the guild economy, and it helped drive an age of technical innovation. As Jean Gimpel showed in The Medieval Machine, the stereotype of the Middle Ages as a period of technological stagnation is utterly off the mark. Medieval craftsmen invented the clock, the cannon, and the movable type printing press, perfected the magnetic compass and the water wheel, and made massive improvements in everything from shipbuilding and steel-making to architecture and windmills, among many other things. The competition between masters and guilds for market share when quality and innovation were the only fields of combat wasn't the only force behind these transformations, to be sure. The medieval monastic system, which put a good fraction of intellectuals of both genders in sheltered workshops where they could use their leisure for any purpose that could be chalked up to the greater glory of God, was also a potent factor, but it certainly played a massive role. Advocates of relocalization in the age of peak oil may thus find it useful to keep the medieval example in mind while planning for the economies of the future. Relocalized communities must be economically viable or they will soon cease to exist. And while viable local communities will be possible in the future, just as they were in the Middle Ages, the steps that will be necessary to make them viable may require some serious rethinking of the habits that now shape our economic lives. A future of victory gardens. Plenty of people have argued that the only valid response to the rising spiral of crisis faced by industrial civilization is to build a completely new civilization from the ground up on more idealistic lines. Even if that latter phrase wasn't a guarantee of disaster, if there's one lesson history teaches, it's that human societies are organic growths, and trying to invent one to fit some abstract idea of goodness is as foredoomed as trying to make an ecosystem do what human beings want. We no longer have time for grand schemes of that sort. To shift metaphors, when your ship has already hit the iceberg and the water's coming in, it's a bit late to suggest rebuilding it from the keel up according to some new scheme of naval engineering. An even larger number of people have argued with equal zeal that the only valid response to the predicament of our time is to save the existing order of things, with whatever modest improvements the person in question happens to fancy, because the alternative is too horrible to contemplate. They may be right, too, if saving the existing order of things was possible, but at this point it's not. A global civilization that is utterly dependent for its survival on ever-expanding supplies of cheap, abundant energy and a stable planetary biosphere is not going to make it in a world of ever-contracting supplies of scarce and expensive energy, and a planetary biosphere that the civilization's own activities are pushing into radical instability. Again, when your ship has already hit the iceberg and the water's coming in, it's not helpful to insist that the only option is to keep streaming toward a distant port. What that leaves, to borrow a useful term from one of the most insightful books of the last round of energy crises, is muddling through. Until recently, at least, Warren Johnson's muddling toward frugality seemed to have dropped into the limbo our cultural memory reserves for failed prophecies. Neither he nor, to be fair to him, anybody else in the sustainability movement of the 70s had any idea that the collective response of most industrial nations to the approach of the limits to growth would turn out to be a 30-year vacation from sanity, in which short-term political gimmicks and wildly extravagant drawdown of irreplaceable resources would be widely mistaken for permanent solutions. That put paid to Johnson's hope that simple day-by-day adjustments to dwindling energy and resource supplies would cushion the transition from an economy of abundance to one of frugality. His strategy, though, still has one thing going for it that no other available approach can match. It can still be applied this late in the game. If it's done with enough enthusiasm or desperation, and with a clear sense of the nature of our predicament, it could still get a fair number of us through the mess ahead. And it certainly offers better odds than sitting on our hands and waiting for the ship to sink, which under one pretense or another is the only other option open to us right now. A strategy of muddling doesn't lend itself to nice, neat checklists of what to do and what to try, so I won't presume to offer a step-by-step plan. Still, showing one way to muddle, or to begin muddling, and outlining some of the implications of that choice can bridge the gap between abstraction and action and suggest ways that those who are about to muddle might approach the task. And of course, there's always a chance that the example might be applicable to some of the people who read it. With this in mind, I want to talk about victory gardens. As the rising spiral of economic troubles continues, we can expect drastic volatility in the value and availability of money. And here again, remember that the word money refers to any form of wealth that only has value because it can be exchanged for something else. Any economic activity that is solely a means of bringing in money will be held in hostage to the vagaries of the tertiary economy, whether those express themselves through inflation, credit collapse, or what have you. Any economic activity that produces goods and services directly for the use of the producer and his or her family and community will be much less drastically affected by those vagaries. If you depend on your salary to buy vegetables, for example, how much you can eat depends on the value of money at any given moment. If you grow your own vegetables using your own kitchen and garden scraps to fertilize the soil and saving your own seed, you have a much more direct control over your vegetable supply. The victory garden as a social response to crisis was an invention of the 20th century. Much before then, it would have been a waste of time to encourage civilians in time of war to dig up their backyards and put in vegetable gardens because nearly everybody who had a backyard had a garden already in it. That was originally why houses had backyards, the household economy, which produced much of the goods and services used by people in pre-petroleum Europe and America, didn't stop at the four walls of a house. Garden beds, cold frames, and hen houses in urban backyards kept pantries full, while no self-respecting farm wife would have done without the garden out back and a dozen or so fruit trees close by the farmhouse. Those useful habits only went into decline when rail transportation and the commercialization of urban food supplies gave birth to the modern city in the course of the 19th century. When 1914 came around and Europe blundered into the carnage of the First World War, the entire system had to be reinvented from scratch in many urban areas, since the transport networks that brought fresh food to the cities in peacetime had other things to do, and importing food from overseas became problematic for all combatants in a time of naval blockades and unrestricted submarine warfare. The lessons learned from that experience became a standard part of military planning thereafter. And when the Second World War came, well-organized victory garden programs shifted into high gear, helping to take the hard edges off food rationing. It's a measure of their success that despite the massive mismatch between Britain's wartime population and its capacity to grow food, and the equally massive challenge of getting food imports through a gauntlet of U-boats, food shortages in Britain never reached the level of actual famine. In the 70s, in turn, the same thing happened on a smaller scale without government action. All over the industrial world, people who were worried about the future started digging victory gardens in their backyards, and books offering advice on backyard gardening became steady sellers. Some of those are still in print today. These days, sales figures in the home garden industry reliably jolt upwards whenever the economy turns south or something else sends fears about the future upwards. For many people, planting a victory garden has become a nearly instinctive response to troubled times. It's fashionable in some circles to dismiss this sort of thing as an irrelevance, but such analyses miss the point of the phenomena. The reason that the victory garden has become a fixture for our collective response to trouble is that it engages one of the core features of the predicament individuals and families face in the twilight of the industrial age, the disconnection between the tertiary economy on the one hand and the primary and secondary economies on the other. The value you get from a backyard garden differs from the value you get from your job or your savings in a crucial way. Money doesn't mediate between your labor and the results. If you save your own seeds, use your own muscles, and fertilize the soil with compost you make from kitchen and garden waste, and many gardeners do these things as a matter of course, the only money your gardening requires of you is whatever you spend on beer after a hard day's work. The vegetables that help feed your family are produced by the primary economy of soil and sun, and the secondary economy of sweat. The tertiary economy has been cut out of the loop. Now, it will doubtless be objected that nobody can grow all the food for a family in an ordinary backyard, so the rest of their food remains hostage to the tertiary economy. This is more or less true, but it's less important than it looks. Even in a really thumping depression, very few people have no access to money at all. The problem is much more one of not having enough money to get everything you need by way of the tertiary economy. An effective response usually involves placing any economic activity that can be done without the involvement of money outside the reach of the tertiary economy, and prioritizing whatever money can be had for those uses that require it. You're not likely to be able to grow field crops in your backyard, for example, but grains, dried beans, and the like can be bought in bulk very cheaply at present, and will almost certainly be available in bulk across North America even in times of turmoil. What can't be bought cheaply now, and in a time of financial chaos may not be for sale at all, are exactly the things you can most effectively grow in a backyard garden: the vegetables, vine and shrub fruits, eggs, chicken and rabbit meat, and other foods that provide the vitamins, minerals, and nutrients you can't get from 50-pound sacks of rice and beans. These are the sorts of things people a century and a half ago produced in their kitchen gardens, along with medicinal herbs to treat illnesses and maybe a few dye plants for homespun fabric. These are the sorts of things that make sense to grow at home in a world where the economy won't support the kind of abundance most people in the industrial world take for granted today. It will also doubtless be objected that even if you reduce the amount of money you need for food, you still need money for other things, and so a victory garden isn't the answer. This is true enough if your definition of an answer requires that it simultaneously solve every aspect of the predicament of modern industrial society. Waiting for the one perfect answer to come around is a refined version of doing nothing while the water rises. Muddling requires making many small adjustments rather than one grand plan. Planting a victory garden in the backyard is one adjustment to the impact of a dysfunctional money economy on the far from minor issue of getting food on the table. Other impacts will require other adjustments. A third objection is that not everybody can plant a victory garden in the backyard. This is true enough. A good many people don't have backyards these days, and some of those who do are forbidden by restrictive covenants from using their yards as anything but props for their home's largely imaginary resale value. Still, a victory garden is simply an example of the way that people have muddled through hard times in the past, and might well muddle through the impending round of hard times in the future. If you can't grow a garden in your backyard, see if there's a neighbor or a neighborhood allotment program that will let you garden somewhere else. Or look for something else that will let you meet some of your needs with your own labor without letting money get in the way. That latter, of course, is the central point of this example. At a time when the tertiary economy is undergoing the first stages of an uncontrolled and challenging simplification, if you can disconnect something you need from that economy, you've insulated a part of your life from at least some of the impacts of the chaotic resolution of the mismatch between limitless paper wealth and the limited real wealth available to our species on this very finite planet. Now, of course, it's true that the cost of equipping somebody to perform some economic function locally has already entered the rising collective conversation around peak oil in an informal way. What Transition Towns proponent Rob Hopkins calls the Great Reskilling, the process by which individuals who have no productive skills outside a centralized industrial economy learn how to make and do things on their own, has had to take place within a tolerably strict constraints of what individuals can afford to buy in the way of tools and workspaces, since there isn't exactly a torrent of grant money available for people who want to become blacksmiths, brewers, boat builders, or practitioners of other useful crafts. It may be worth suggesting, though, that Schumacher's theory of intermediate technology might be worth applying directly by those individuals and communities who are willing to put that project into practice. The less it costs in terms of energy and other resources to prepare a community to deal with one or more of its economic needs, after all, the more will be available for other projects. Equally, the more good ideas that can be garnered from the dusty pages of publications issued by Schumacher's Intermediate Technology Development Group and its many equivalents, and put to work during the industrial world's decline to third world status, the more creativity can be spared for other challenges. After retirement. The transformations that will force the expansion of Victory Gardens also promises, as Chapter 3 suggested, to bring an end to one of the most basic expectations of people in today's industrial world. Retirement as a social habit was entirely the product of the zenith of the Age of Abundance. For a brief window of time, rather less than a century, it made financial and political sense for nations in the developed world to pay their elderly citizens to stay out of the workforce in order to keep unemployment down to politically bearable levels. All this unfolded in turn from an industrial economy so lavishly supplied with cheap energy that human labor was worth replacing with machines wherever the technology permitted, and so greedy for new markets that every part of human life was made subject to market forces. Before that period began, something less than half of all economic activity, even in the industrial world, had anything to do with the market at all. Most women and many men outside the age of regular employment worked in the household economy, governed by custom and interfamily exchange rather than market forces. This included essentially everyone who would be eligible for retirement by the standards of the age that has just ended. Outside the market, but not outside the demand for skilled labor, elderly people typically provided household goods and services to a household somewhere in their extended family. This was their full-time job. By contributing the value of their labor and skills, they earned their keep. The end of the age of cheap energy means that such household economies will be viable again. It also means that they will again be necessary. When the limited energy and resources of a contracting society have to be prioritized for urgent needs, takeout meals and convenience foods will sooner or later draw the short straw. In their absence, most food will once again be made at home from raw ingredients. When the energy cost of a global network of sweatshops that keeps Americans clothed can no longer be met, clothing will once again be made at home from raw fiber, as it was not long ago, and so on. All this requires human labor. Thus, a society no longer supplied with nearly unlimited amounts of cheap, abundant energy will have every incentive to keep elderly people in the household labor force, and neither the incentive nor the resources to keep them in comfortable idleness. Now, of course, it's true that we will not be landing in such a society overnight. It's also true that the clout of the retiree lobby in most industrial nations is such that public and private pensions will be looted or simply dissolve in a general financial collapse only when every other option has been exhausted. though in the United States at least, the vast tide of red ink currently flooding out of Washington, D.C. is likely to bring about this eventuality sooner rather than later. Still, it's quite possible that at least some of today's retirees and soon-to-be retirees will manage to cling to that status, at least for a while. If I were asked for advice about retirement then, it would probably go something like this. If you're already retired or within a few years of retirement, it's probably worthwhile to put any investment money you have into a stable investment, if you can find one. Still, it's unwise to assume that your investments will be worth anything in the long run, and having a plan B would be a very good idea. If you're more than a decade or so out from retirement, having a plan B in place is essential. If you're 30 years out or more, as I am, forget about plan A for now. You can look into the options for investment later, once the wreckage of the last few decades has been hauled away and a new economic order has begun to take shape. But you probably will never retire. What sort of plan B might work best depends on so many local and personal variables that specifics would be misleading. If you've got a large family with whom you're on good terms, bone up on your home and economics skills. 10 years from now, when 4 of your grandkids, their spouses, and their children live in one rundown McMansion, having Grandma and Grandpa there to cook meals, tend children, and tend the garden will likely be worth much more than your keep. If you don't have a family or you can't stand them, cultivate friendships with younger friends, or get ready to take up a second career that you can continue into advanced old age. No matter what you choose, it's not going to be as much fun as sitting on a lawn chair in a Sunbelt trailer park, but then the future is under no obligation to limit itself to those options we prefer. More generally, the world of money will become much less relevant to most people in the years to come. Few of us will have the option of separating themselves completely from the money economy for many years to come. As long as today's governments continue to function, for example, they will demand money for taxes, and money will continue to be the gateway resource for many goods and services, including some that will be very difficult to do without. Still, there's no reason why distancing oneself from the tertiary economy has to be an all-or-nothing thing. Any step toward the direct production of goods and services for one's own use, with one's own labor, using resources under one's own direct control, is a step toward the world that will emerge after money. It's also a safety cushion against the disintegration of the tertiary economy going on around us.
November 19th, 2025. As I pause before beginning to put into YouTube format the Afterword of John Michael Greer's The Wealth of Nature.
Afterword. Small is beautiful. It has been nearly 4 decades now since the limits to industrial civilization's trajectory of limitless material growth on a limited planet have been clearly visible on the horizon of our future. Over that time, a remarkable paradox has unfolded. The closer we get to the limits to growth, the more clearly those limits impact our lives, and the more obviously our current trajectory points toward a brick wall of a difficult future, the less most people in the industrial world seem to be able to imagine any alternative to driving the existing order of things until the wheels fall off. This is as true in many corners of the activist community as it is in the most unregenerate of corporate boardrooms. For most of today's environmentalists, for example, renewable energy isn't something that people ought to produce for themselves, unless they happen to be wealthy enough to afford the rooftop PV systems that have become the latest status symbol in suburban neighborhoods on either coast of the U.S. It's something that utilities and governments are supposed to bring online as fast as possible, using existing power grids and habits of energy use, so that people in the industrial world can keep on using as much electricity as they want. This approach is far from the only option available. In the energy crisis of the 70s, simple conservation and efficiency measures sent the world petroleum consumption down by 15% in a single decade, and caused comparable drops in other forms of energy consumption across the industrial world. Most of these measures went out the window in the final binge of the age of cheap oil that followed, so there's plenty of low-hanging fruit to pluck. That same era saw a great many thoughtful people envision ways that we could lead relatively comfortable and humane lives while consuming a great deal less energy and the products of energy than people in the industrial world do today. It can be a troubling experience to turn the pages of Rain Book or the Book of the New Alchemists, to name only two of the better products of that mostly forgotten era, and compare the sweeping view of future possibilities that undergirded their approach to a future of energy and material shortages with the cramped imaginations of the present. It's even more troubling to notice that you can pick up yellowing copies of most of these books for a couple of dollars each in the used book trade, at a time when their practical advice is more relevant than ever, and their prophecies of what would happen if the road to sustainability was not taken are looking more prescient by the day. Thus, our collective refusal to follow the lead of those who urged us to learn how to get by with less has not spared us the necessity of doing exactly that. That's the problem, ultimately, with driving headlong at a brick wall. You can stop by standing on the brake pedal, or you can stop by hitting the wall, but either way, you're going to stop. The brick wall ahead of us at this point in history marks, among other things, the conclusion of a long historical trajectory. From the early days of the Industrial Revolution into the early 1970s, the United States possessed the immense economic advantage of sizable reserves of whatever the cutting-edge energy source happened to be. During what Lewis Mumford called the ecotechnic era, when water wheels were the prime mover for industry and canals were the core transportation technology, the United States prospered because it had an abundance of mill sites and internal waterways. During Mumford's Paleotechnic era, when coal and railways replaced water and canal boats, the United States once again found itself blessed with huge coal reserves. And with the arrival of the Neotechnic era, when petroleum and highways became the new foundation of power, the United States found that nature had supplied it with so much oil that in 1950 it produced more petroleum than all the other countries combined. That trajectory came to an abrupt end in the 1970s, when nuclear power, expected by nearly everyone to be the next step in the sequence, turned out to be hopelessly uneconomical, and renewables proved unable to take up the slack at a cost the American political class was willing to pay. The neotechnic age, in effect, turned out to have no successor. Since then, the United States has been trying to stave off the inevitable sharp downward readjustment of our national standard of living and international importance, following the depletion of the natural resources that once undergirded American economic and political power. In the effort to prevent that readjustment from happening, the U.S. tried accelerating drawdown of natural resources, abandoning our national infrastructure, our industries, and our agricultural hinterlands, and building ever more baroque systems of financial gimmickry to prop up our decaying economy with wealth from overseas. Over the last decade and a half, the government has resorted to systematically inflating speculative bubbles, and now, with its back to the wall, the U.S. is printing money, under the euphemism of quantitative easing, as though there's no tomorrow. It's possible that the current U.S. administration will be able to pull one more rabbit out of its hat and find a new gimmick to keep things going for a while longer. I have to confess that this does not look likely to me. Monetizing debt, as economists call the attempt to pay a nation's bills by means of the printing press, is a desperation move. It's hard to imagine any reason that would have been chosen if there had been any other option in sight. What this means is that we may just have moved into the endgame of America's losing battle with the consequences of its own history. For many years now, people in the community of those concerned about the future have had, or thought they had, the luxury of ample time to make plans and take action. Every so often, books would be written and speeches made, claiming that something had to be done right away while there was still time. But most people took that as the rhetorical flourish it usually was, and went on with their lives in the confident expectation that the crisis was still a long ways off. We may no longer have that option, If I read this science correctly, America has finally reached the point where its economy is so far into ecological imbalance that disintegration is beginning in earnest. If so, a great many of the things most of us in this country have treated as permanent fixtures are likely to go away over the years immediately before us, as the United States transforms itself into a third world country. The changes involved won't be sudden, and it seems unlikely that most of them will get much play in the domestic mass media. A decade from now, let's say, when half the American workforce has no steady work, decaying suburbs have mutated into squalid shantytowns, and domestic insurgencies flare across the South and the Mountain West, those who still have access to cable television will no doubt be able to watch talking heads explain how we're better off than we were in 2000. The economic debacle we are experiencing didn't just happen by chance. It became inevitable once the political classes of the industrial world convinced themselves that money was the source of wealth rather than the mere measure of wealth it actually is. Decades of bad policy that encouraged making money at the expense of the production of real wealth followed from those ideas. The result was the transformation of a vast amount of paper quote-unquote wealth, that is, money of one kind or another, into some malign equivalent of the twinkle dust of a child's fairy tale. One way to make sense of the resulting collision between the brittle front end of industrial civilization and the hard surface of nature's brick wall is to compare the spring of 2010 with the autumn of 2007. Those two seasons had an interesting detail in common. In both cases, the price of oil passed $80 a barrel after a prolonged period of price increases, and in both cases this was followed by a massive debt crisis. In 2007, largely driven by speculation in the futures market, the price of oil kept on zooming upwards, peaking just south of $150 a barrel before crashing back to earth. So far, at least, there's no sign of a spike of that sort happening this time, although this is mostly because speculators are focused on other assets these days. In 2007, though, the debt crisis also resulted in a dramatic economic downturn, and as I write these words, the world's chances of dodging a repeat of the same experience do not look good. Here in the U.S., most measures of general economic activity are faltering where they aren't plunging. The sole exceptions are those temporarily propped up by an unparalleled explosion of government debt. And unemployment has become so deeply entrenched that what we do about the very large number of Americans who have exhausted the 99 weeks of unemployment benefits that current law allows them in most states is becoming a significant political issue. Even the illegal economy is taking a massive hit. A recent news story broadcast on National Public Radio noted that the price of marijuana has dropped so sharply that Northern California, where it's a major cash crop, is seeing panic selling and sharp economic contractions. What's going on here is precisely what the limits to growth warned us about in 1973. The costs of continued growth have risen faster than growth itself and are reaching a level that is forcing the economy to its knees. By costs, of course, the authors of the limits to growth weren't talking about money. The costs that matter are energy, resources, and labor. It takes a great deal more of all of those to extract oil from deep water wells in the Gulf of Mexico, or oil sands in Alberta, say, than it used to take to get sweet light crude from the shallow strata in Pennsylvania or Texas. And since offshore drilling and oil sands make up an increasingly large share of what we've got left, those wells in Pennsylvania and Texas have been pumped dry, or nearly so. These real, non-monetary costs have climbed steadily. The price of oil in dollars functions here as a workable proxy, in the language of the tertiary economy, for the real cost of oil production in energy, resources, and labor, the hard currency of the primary and secondary economies. The evidence of the last few years suggests that when the price of oil passes $80 a barrel, that's a sign that the primary and secondary costs of energy have risen high enough that the rest of the economy begins to crack under the strain. Since astronomical levels of debt have become a standard practice all through today's global economy, the ability of marginal borrowers to service their debt is where the cracks show up first. In the fall of 2007, many of those marginal borrowers were homeowners in the U.S. and U.K. In the spring of 2010, they included entire nations. Thus, it's past time to realize that the age of abundance is over. The period from 1945 to 2005, when almost unimaginable amounts of cheap petroleum sloshed throughout the economies of the world's industrial nations and transformed life in those nations almost beyond recognition, still shapes most of our thinking and nearly all of our expectations. Not one significant policymaker or mass media pundit in the industrial world has begun to talk about the impact of the end of the age of abundance. It's an open question if any of them have grasped how fundamental the changes will be as the new age of post-abundance economics begins to bear down. Most ordinary people in the industrial world, for their part, are sleepwalking through one of history's great transitions. The issues that concern them are still defined entirely by the calculus of abundance. Most Americans these days, for example, worry about managing a comfortable retirement, paying for increasingly expensive medical care, and providing their children with a college education and whatever amenities they consider important. It has not yet entered their darkest dreams need to worry about access to such basic necessities as food, clothing, and shelter. The fate of local economies and communities shredded by decades of malign neglect, and the rise of serious threats to the survival of constitutional government and the rule of law. Even among those who warn that today's Great Recession could bottom out at a level even worse than that reached in the Great Depression, very few have grappled with the consequences of a near-term future in which millions of Americans live in shantytowns and struggle to find enough to eat every single day. To paraphrase Sinclair Lewis, that did happen here only 80 years ago, and it did so at a time when the United States was a net exporter of industrial products and the world's largest producer and exporter of petroleum to boot. The same scale of economic decline in a nation that exports very little besides unpayable IOUs and is the world's largest consumer and importer of petroleum could easily have results much closer to that of the early 20th century in Central Europe. To suggest only one example, near universal impoverishment, food shortages, epidemics, civil wars, and outbreaks of vicious ethnic cleansing, bracketed by two massive wars that each had body counts in the tens of millions. It needs to be remembered, however, that this did not equate to the total collapse into a Cormac McCarthy future that so many people fantasize about these days. I've spent years wondering why it is that so many people seem unable to conceive of any future other than business as usual on the one hand and apocalyptic extremism on the other. Whatever the motives that drive this curious fixation, though, it results in a nearly complete blindness to the real risks the future is more likely to hold for us. It makes a useful exercise to take current survivalist notions about preparing for the future and ask yourself how many of them would have turned out to be useful over the decade or two ahead if someone had pursued exactly those strategies in Poland or Slovakia, let's say, in the years right before 1914. Measure the difference between the real and terrible events of that period on the one hand, and the fantasies of infinite progress or apocalyptic collapse that so often pass for realistic images of our future on the other, and you have some sense of the gap that has to be crossed in order to make sense of a world after abundance. One way or another, we will cross that gap. The question is how many of us will make the crossing in advance and have time to take constructive actions in response, and how many will do so only in retrospect, thinking ruefully of the dollar and hours spent preparing for an imaginary future while the real one was breathing down their necks. I've talked at quite some length in this and other books about the kind of preparations that will likely help individuals, families, and communities deal with the future of resource shortages, economic implosion, political breakdown, and potential civil war that the missed opportunities and purblind decisions of the last 30 years have made agonizingly likely here in the United States, and, with an infinity of local variations, elsewhere in the industrial world. Those points remain crucial. It still makes a great deal of sense to start growing some of your own food. to radically downsize your dependence on complex technological systems, to reduce your energy consumption as far as possible, to free up at least one family member from the money economy for full-time work in the domestic economy, and so on. Still, there's another dimension to all this, and it has to be mentioned, though it's certain to raise hackles. For the last 3 centuries, and especially for the last half-century or so, it's become increasingly common to define a good life as one provided with the largest possible selection of material goods and services. That definition has become so thoroughly hardwired into our modern ways of thinking that it can be very hard to see past it. Of course, there are certain very basic material needs without which a good life is impossible, but those are a good deal fewer and simpler than contemporary attitudes assume. And once those are provided, material abundance becomes a much more ambivalent blessing than we'd like to think. In a very real sense, this way of thinking mirrors the old joke about the small boy with a hammer who thinks everything is a nail. In an age of unparalleled material abundance, the easy solution for any problem or predicament was to throw material wealth at it. That did solve some problems, but it arguably worsened others, and left the basic predicaments of human existence untouched. Did it really benefit anyone to spend trillions of dollars and the talents of some of our civilization's brightest minds creating high-end medical treatments to keep the very sick alive and miserable for a few extra months of life, for example, so that we could pretend to ourselves that we had evaded the basic human predicament of the inevitability of death? Whatever the answer, the end of the age of abundance draws a line under that experiment. Within not too many years, it's safe to predict, only the relatively rich will have the dubious privilege of spending the last months of their lives hooked up to complicated life support equipment. The rest of us will end our lives the way our great-grandparents did, at home, more often than not, with family members and maybe a nurse to provide palliative care, while our bodies do what they were born to do, and shut down. Within not too many years, more broadly, only a very few people anywhere in the world will have the option of trying to escape the core uncertainties and challenges of human existence by chasing round after round of consumer goods. The rest of us will count ourselves lucky to have the basic material needs squarely provided for, and will have to deal once again with fundamental questions of meaning and value. It probably will come as no surprise that here again E.F. Schumacher was well ahead of the rest of us. His final, posthumously published book, A Guide for the Perplexed, left behind the economic topics that occupied most of his public career to ask hard questions and propose provocative answers concerning the most basic issues surrounding human life. It would take another book the size of this one, if not larger, to offer any meaningful comment on the points Schumacher raised in this slender volume. But one theme that runs throughout it is a recognition that material wealth, however defined, only satisfies a certain sharply limited number of human needs, and a life oriented entirely toward material accumulation has failed to deal with most of the possibilities open to human existence. In the recognition of that failure, other possibilities open up. Still, the habits of thought instilled in us by an age of abundance get in the way of recognizing most of those possibilities. It's worth noting that while there's plenty of talk about the monasteries of the Dark Ages among people who are aware of the impending decline and fall of our own civilization, next to none of it has discussed, much less dealt with, the secret behind the success of monasticism, the deliberate acceptance of extreme material poverty. Quite the contrary. All the plans for lifeboat eco-villages I've encountered, so far at least, aim at preserving some semblance of a middle-class lifestyle into the indefinite future. That choice puts these projects in the same category as the lavish villas in which the wealthy inhabitants of Roman Britain hoped to ride out their own trajectory of decline and fall, a category most notable for its long history of total failure. The European Christian monasteries that preserved Roman culture through the Dark Ages did not offer anyone a middle-class lifestyle by the standards of their own time, much less those of ours. Neither did the Buddhist monasteries that preserved Heian culture through the Shinkojida, Japan's bitter age of wars, or the Buddhist and Taoist monasteries that preserved classical Chinese culture through a good half-dozen cycles of collapse, or any of the other examples of successful monasticism in history. Monasteries in all these cases were places people went to be very, very poor. That was the secret of their achievements, because when you reduce your material needs to the absolute minimum, the energy you don't spend maintaining your standard of living can be put to work doing something more useful. Now, it's probably too much to hope for that some similar movement might spring into being here and now. We're a couple of centuries too soon for that. The great age of Christian monasticism in the West didn't begin until the 6th century CE, by which time the Roman economy of abundance had been gone for so long that nobody even pretended that material wealth was an answer to the human condition. Still, the monastic revolution kick-started by Benedict of Nursia drew on a long history of Christian monastic ventures. Those unfolded in turn from the first tentative communal hermitages of early Christian Egypt. And all these projects, though this is not often mentioned, took part of their inspiration and a good deal of their ethos from the Stoics of pagan Greece and Rome. Movements away from an obsession with material wealth are in fact very common in civilizations that have passed the Hubbert's peak of their own core resource base. There's good reason for that. In a contracting economy, it becomes easier to notice that the less you need, the less vulnerable you are to the ups and downs of fortune, and the more you can get done of whatever it is that you happen to want to do. That's an uncongenial lesson at the best of times, and during times of material abundance, you won't find many people learning it. It's one of the marks of Schumacher's insights that he did learn it, and tried in various ways to communicate it to a mostly uninterested world. Still, in the world after abundance, it's hard to think of a lesson that deserves more careful attention.